Welcome back, everybody. We're now going to start our second panel on citizenship and its gatekeepers. I'm going to ask the panelists to come up and occupy their seats, and while they do so, allow me to introduce Professor Phil Deloria to you. Phil, who is I'm just so absolutely thrilled and charged that he has joined us here at Harvard. It is a real a revolution and an awakening on campus. Is a professor of history at Harvard University. His research focuses on the social, cultural, and political histories of the relations among American Indian peoples in the United States. He's author of some very important books. Many of you may know them, but if you don't, Playing Indian, Yale University Press in 1998, Indians in Unexpected Places, Kansas 2004, American Studies, A User's Guide, 2017, and forthcoming, and it is beautiful, and you just go to one of his talks. There's going to be an event at Harvard Bookstore,
May 4th?
May 4th.
Or 6th?
Check it out, or 6th or something. Go both days. Becoming Mary Sully Toward an American Indian Abstract. Just a beautiful volume, a really remarkable volume. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Phil and this remarkable panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here, and I think we all want to pause and thank and acknowledge the first panel, which set up so many interesting questions for us to contemplate around some of these questions. So in our first session, of course, we talked about economic citizenship. When we were having the planning meetings, there was a lot of conversation about this, and I had sort of forgotten what a deeply interesting kind of set of problems really come up when we put these things together and think about them. So we've thought a bit about the uneven distributions of wealth and how these things produce an uneven range of citizenship, sort of gradated scales of rights, privileges, responsibilities, things like choke points, chickenization, new economic kinds of constraints which actually sort of affect our practice of citizenship. So in this session, Citizenship and Its Gatekeepers, we want to turn to a more sort of concrete, almost a case study sort of approach to some of the structures that gatekeep and that sometimes enable, and I think it's important to sort of understand the sort of dialectic relationship there, that enable citizenship, and the experiences of people encountering some of those structures. We might sort of quickly think a bit about what we want to do here, I think, is take some of three of the sort of central master narratives that show up in American history and that sort of diffuse out from that, and that would be the story of conquest concerning American Indian people, indigenous people, the story of slavery concerning African and African-descended people and indigenous people as well, and then immigration and the ways in which immigration, as we know, plays into all of these kinds of economic sorts of questions. So we might imagine a set of legislative acts that sort of structure how we think about this. For me, this always begins with the 3/5 clause, which students happily, I poll my students every semester, and they happily tell me it's all about 3/5 of an enslaved person for purposes of proportional representation. What they almost always miss is the other clause in there, Indians not taxed, which establishes a certain kind of ground for Native people to be in the Constitution as being excluded from the Constitution, and setting up the sort of baseline or the grounding within the American constitutional system to imagine Indian people as discrete and separate political entities who might leave those entities behind and become members of the American polity. So from there, we might imagine thinking about the 14th Amendment of the Civil Rights legislations of the 1960s, the 1924 Citizenship Act, which brings Native people into the American citizenship regime, the Indian Reorganization Act, as Rosita Worrell talked about, the 1924 Immigration Act, the 1965 Immigration Act. All of these things are, I think, part and parcel of the structure of what we want to think about today. So we have three fabulous speakers. I will introduce them in order. Jill Doerfler is professor in and the head of the Department of American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. Her most recent book, Those Who Belong, Identity, Family, Blood, and Citizenship Among the White Earth Anishinaabe, examines staunch Anishinaabe resistance to racialization and the complex issues surrounding tribal citizenship and identity. And Jill has spent the last many, many years sort of deeply engaged in this from a community kind of position. Pap Ndiaye Is professor of history at Sciences Po, where he specializes in the history of black minorities in the United States and France. He's published a number of things which are all really interesting and all of which have French titles. And for me to say Sciences Po, and so that's as close as I can get. So, but I do want to sort of mention some of the fascinating conversations we had last night. He's a member of the scientific committee for an exhibit, Le Médaille Noire, which opened at the Museum d'Orsay on March 26th, and which completely is this incredible and important effort rewriting in terms of race and, I think, arguably citizenship, some of the sort of classic paintings that we associate with French and other kinds of paintings. Chia Youyee Vang is professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she also serves as associate vice chancellor in the Division of Global Inclusion and Engagement. She's the author of Hmong America, Reconstructing Community in Diaspora, as well as a number of other kinds of texts. And so what we'll be bringing to you, hopefully, is a series of really interesting and evocative kinds of treatments that will illuminate some of the things we heard today and lead into the conversation we'll be having over the rest of the day. Jill, I turn things over to you.
Miigwech, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of these interesting and important conversations. And Phil, as you noted, that important groundwork that was laid by the first panel. For me, especially for Rosita's panel, I think that will set up some of the things I'm going to talk about quite nicely. So one of the vital activities for American Indian nations is the regulation of citizenship. Citizenship is, of course, a much debated topic in many countries, with some currently questioning longstanding citizenship requirements in the wake of political changes. And American Indians are also in that similar situation. Historically, American Indian nations had a wide range of ways in which people were accepted into their nations. But as we've moved into the modern paperwork, card-carrying kind of citizenship era, the US became increasingly influential on the citizenship requirements. So today I'm going to share from my research about how the Minnesota Chippewa tribe came to adopt a 1/4 Minnesota Chippewa tribe blood quantum minimum for tribal citizenship in 1961. And then briefly, as time allows, White Earth nations' efforts for constitutional reform, including citizenship in the early 2000s. So mostly, I don't have a lot of slides today, but I'm going to put up the map slide just to help give some context and background. The Minnesota Chippewa tribe is unique in that it is 6 member nations or reservations combined together under a single constitution. And so just to give us the reservations here, we see moving our way from west to east, the White Earth Nation, my home nation. Then we see Leech Lake, Boys Fort, Mille Lacs, Fond du Lac, and then Grand Portage far up on the North Shore. You'll note that the term here is Minnesota Chippewa tribe. That's the official legal name. We also use Ojibwe and Anishinaabe, and my preference for Anishinaabe will guide some of my terminology today, so I'll also be using that. The Minnesota Chippewa Tribe Constitution was adopted and approved in 1936 in accordance with the Indian Reorganization Act, and each of the 6 reservations or nations that make up that governing body maintain a degree of autonomy but govern under that single constitution. Citizenship with American Indian nations is also sometimes called enrollment, also sometimes called membership. I'll be fluctuating between those terms and citizenship today. While the US courts and the Bureau of Indian Affairs have officially recognized the inherent sovereignty of American Indian nations to define and regulate citizenship, in practice, the BIA has pushed some tribes, including the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, to enact blood quantum requirements. Citizenship became a pressing issue shortly after the formation of the MCT and was discussed at length at several Tribal Executive Committee, or TEC, which I'll be using today. The Tribal Executive Committee is the governing body of the tribe, and those minutes are rich in detail and record a great record for us. So many Anishinaabe at the TEC meetings held in May of 1940 spoke about the negative impact that using blood quantum for tribal citizenship would have on their children and grandchildren. For example, Bill Eniwash from White Earth declared that he did not approve of the use of blood quantum. He felt it would institute a great harm because it would deprive their children of participation in the MCT. William Nickabone from Mille Lacs stated, quote, "I personally wouldn't want to be a party to this striking off of our youths for the reason that my children in the future may have these mixed bloods, and I don't want them to say that I have done that, restricting them from the rolls," end quote. Eniwash and Nickabone's resistance to blood quantum reflects a concern for their family and their responsibility to ensure that future generations would have the ability to become Minnesota Chippewa tribe citizens. Likewise, Bill Morrill from Leech Lake spoke out against blood quantum. He also talked about future generations as well as equality, stating, "I feel this way. The only way we can ever reach a settlement is that no matter how small quantity of blood an Indian man has, he should have the privileges of a Chippewa Indian. We are all human, just like any other people in this world. Why would you deprive your own grandson of the rights of a Chippewa Indian? We aren't like dogs who go and forget their pups as soon as they're big enough to go off by themselves." Here, Morrill uses family as leverage to call for the TEC to follow Anishinaabe values and practices. And he further advises the Tribal Executive Committee to, quote, "be guided by the love of your children, your little grandchildren, even if they are mixed bloods." He continues, "You can't tell your own relatives to get out because they aren't full bloods. If you are a loving people, consider the people you are going to hurt by making that demarcation. Think how bad that poor old Indian woman is going to feel when she hears that her little grandson is not a member of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe." Morrill's call for the traditional value of love to guide decision-making is compelling. His comments also raise questions about the future of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. What would happen to the nation if citizenship declined and future generations were, in fact, excluded? In addition to the concerns for future generations that were expressed at the meeting, past generations were also mentioned. So Mr. Savage from Fond du Lac noted that their forefathers had included mixed bloods in treaties made with the United States. And he asked, quote, "Why should we go on the record as opposing the mixed bloods when they were approved of by our forefathers so many years ago?" Asking this question forced those at the meeting to think about the ways in which their ancestors had addressed the same question of including mixed bloods. And so the question of tribal citizenship was not only about the inclusion of future generations, but also about honoring the wishes of their ancestors and continuing Anishinaabe practices of inclusion and caring for relatives. 1 year later, at meetings in May and July of 1941, tribal citizenship was again a prominent issue. Mr. Rogers from White Earth began by summarizing the discussion from May 1940, and he noted that this question of citizenship had come up for the last 5 years. So this is just a small summary of what they have been talking about over and over again in these meetings. And he said, now it's been 5 years. We have basic agreement that everyone who is descended from what they called the Treaty of 1889, which we know as the Nelson Act, he said everyone that is a descendant of that should be eligible for tribal citizenship. And so he worked with the Bureau to draft up a resolution. Rogers explained, quote, "These rules throw the gate wide open. Any descendant of the original members who are entitled to enrollment under the treaty or agreement of 1889 are entitled to enrollment. These rules provide that any descendant, no matter what degree of Indian blood he possesses, or where he lives, or where he is born, so long as he can prove that he is a descendant or issue of the original families, is entitled to enrollment under these regulations. We want to enroll everybody who is entitled to enrollment. We didn't want to consider the quantum of Indian blood, the place they were born, or where they lived." So Rogers was attentive and deliberate with the citizenship requirement that he drafted. The suggestion for generous inclusion was grounded in family relationships, Anishinaabe values, and all of the sentiments that have been expressed by the delegates over several years. We also see that they don't want to exclude anyone who is, quote, entitled to citizenship, indicating that a restriction like blood quantum or restriction like place of birth would be a form of disenfranchisement. So the resolution went forward to the political body and was approved in July of 1941. Then, as required by the MCT Constitution, the resolution was submitted to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs for approval. That took a little bit of time, as workings at the Bureau do. More than a year later, Oscar Chapman, Assistant Secretary of the Department of Interior, wrote to the Minnesota Chippewa tribe rejecting the resolution. Chapman noted that the policy would create increased membership, which of course they were very aware of that's what they were doing. But Chapman notes that it's going to increase membership, but it's not going to result in increased funding from Congress, which really wasn't a part of their discussions at all. This is his imposition of that. So the letter states in part, if the Minnesota Chippewa Indians desire to share their property with a large number of persons who are Indians neither by name, residence, or attachment, but by merely the accident of a small portion of Indian blood, the Minnesota Chippewa tribe must realize that every new name which they add to the membership roll will by that much decrease the share every member now has in the limited assets of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. And I feel like you can hear the paternalism oozing from these letters. So here, Chapman's direct implication is that the fewer citizens there are, the more resources there are going to be for each individual. So bringing economics into the citizenship discussion here. He is attempting to sway the Minnesota Chippewa tribe into passing a citizenship resolution that would be more restrictive. He presumed that the Minnesota Chippewa tribe elected leaders and citizens would be more concerned with monetary compensation than with the inclusion of their family members as citizens. In the following years, the Bureau of Indian Affairs advised the Minnesota Chippewa tribe to adopt a more restrictive requirement for citizenship, noting that if they were going to submit another resolution that was the same, based on this concept of lineal descent, they would again be rejected, and they were several times. So to speed us along here, despite these setbacks, for a number of years, the Tribal Executive Committee continued to push for lineal descent as the requirement for citizenship, but they were unsuccessful in ever getting that approved. In fact, as they were told, those resolutions would be rejected, and they were. So I'm going to speed us ahead to 1961, which is when the Tribal Executive Committee finally bowed to these pressures and passed a citizenship requirement. The ordinance stated, quote, after the approval of this ordinance by the Secretary of Interior, all children born to the parent or parents whose names appear on the basic membership roll shall be eligible for membership, provided they possess at least 1/4 degree Minnesota Chippewa Indian blood, and provided further that an application for enrollment is filed with the Secretary of the tribal delegates within 1 year of birth. And we see in this resolution, they're already acknowledging as soon as the Secretary approves this, they're finally giving in to that pressure. The Minnesota Chippewa tribe president has to qualify what they've passed. And president at that time was John Pemberton, and he said, quote, it was necessary to set the 1/4 degree blood quantum in the ordinance in order to receive the approval of the Department of the Interior, which defines an Indian as being 1/4 or more degree Indian blood. He went on to explain, quote, if the Minnesota Chippewa tribe does not set up enrollment rules, then the department will make their own rules. This is a time when termination is going on in the US, and there have been threatening letters sent to the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. You guys have to decide this, as though they haven't tried to decide it 4 or 5 times, but been rejected. So no surprise, this ordinance was approved by the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. Also during this time period, the Minnesota Chippewa tribe is working to make significant changes to the governing structure. And so what they did was they proposed a whole host of changes in a referendum in 1963. And MCT citizens voted 1,761 in favor and 1,761 for, 1,295 against. And so both as the citizenship gets codified in the Constitution at that time, as does a host of other changes, and the Secretary approves. The shift to blood quantum as the determinant for tribal citizenship in 1961 has, of course, had a significant impact on the MCT. As feared by Anishinaabe leaders, many families have literally been divided by blood quantum, with some family members recognized and other family members excluded. I'm personally in a kind of situation like that. My mother is enrolled as a citizen and I'm not, and we see that pattern. Just as delegates were concerned about future generations, we've seen that come to fruition. Recent research conducted by the Wilder Research Center for the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe found that, quote, the overall population of the MCT is declining under the current 1/4 blood quantum requirement. In her 2007 State of the Nation address, Irma Bisner, chairwoman of the White Earth Nation, spoke of the accomplishments of the tribe as well as future goals, and she announced it was her intention to hold a constitutional convention in the fall, noting that among other issues that needed to be addressed, the citizenship issue needed to. And she stated, quote, as tribal membership continues to decline under the present 1/4 blood quantum requirement, we must decide eligibility for enrollment. 40 White Earth citizens volunteered to serve as delegates in the Constitutional Convention process, and 4 conventions were ultimately held between October 2007 and April 2009. The issue of citizenship was just as significant to the constitutional delegates as it had been more than 50 years earlier. For example, William Enuash's plea to, quote, consider the relationship remained equally relevant. Constitutional delegates discussed citizenship at each convention, and while there was a diverse range of views presented, the discussion often came back to family, as well as the importance of practicing our values, getting those values codified into the Constitution. For example, one delegate stated, everything we do, all the hard work, love, respect, all of that should be pointed toward future generations. Core values should be used to take care of future generations. Others equated citizenship with resources and feared a larger population. For example, one delegate stated, quote, how can we cut this pie any smaller? It scares me. After several lively and lengthy discussion, the constitutional delegates decided that blood quantum was not an appropriate means to define citizenship, and they wanted family relationships to take precedence. And they passed a requirement for tribal citizenship that was lineal descent, that was very much like the same kinds of citizenship requirements that the tribe had tried to get passed years before. Over the next few years, the process stalled. There are lots of political issues to be navigated with White Earth's relationship with the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. The effort finally moved forward in 2013, and White Earth citizens voted to adopt the proposed constitution by a margin of nearly 80%. But despite the landslide approval of the Constitution, elected leaders at White Earth halted the implementation, in part over concerns over lineal descent and also because of this question and uncertainty about White Earth's position within the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. And so the future of the Constitution of the White Earth Nation is uncertain. The U.S. Secretary of Interior, if the U.S. Secretary of the Interior had not rejected the MCT resolutions requiring lineal descent for tribal citizenship, it seems unlikely that the MCT would have ever created and implemented a 1/4 blood quantum requirement. This imposition on the fundamental right of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe to determine citizenship has had lasting consequences. Efforts to eliminate blood quantum as a requirement continue as Anishinaabe refuse to forget about their children. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you very much, Philip, for your kind presentation. Thank you very much to the organizers of this important conference. It's a pleasure and an honor to be part of it. My presentation aims at raising a number of issues about the connection between citizenship and race in France. In spite of its proclaimed universalist colorblind principles, the French state has incorporated race as a central element into its policies of citizenship. Black persons in France often find their citizenship questioned in a suspicious way. As I will show, they are often seen as foreigners, possibly undocumented migrants. Although trained as a historian of the US and still working on US history, I have delved more and more in French history, partly because of my French Senegalese origins, but also because as a citizen of France, I felt almost obliged to deal with these issues. In July of 2016, in a police station located in the working-class suburbs of Paris, where uprisings took place in 2005, a 24-year-old black man named Adama Traoré died of natural causes, as the police stated. The Traoré family protested and asked for a full inquiry regarding the causes of the death. We soon learned that Traoré died in this police station because he couldn't breathe. His neck and chest were crushed by 3 policemen standing on him. A few days later, a demonstration took place in Paris with hundreds of protesters all asking for the truth. A movement, Black Lives Matter France, was created, and you can see that on the slide behind me. In other words, the American situation, far from being totally foreign, has often been a means or a window through which to question French society and politics. Of course, BLM France is much smaller and marginal than BLM USA, not only in demographic terms, but also politically speaking. Anti-racism in France has been struggling, facing an aggressive ultra-rightist opposition. Anti-racism in my country doesn't have a history of political victories that could energize new generations of activists. No civil rights movement in France, but a long history of intellectuals and activists trying to bring to the forefront racial inequalities and questioning the very meaning of citizenship, so closely linked to Frenchness, as you will see. There is clearly a growing interest for these issues in France, including on the fine art scene. The Musée d'Orsay, as Philippe mentioned, has just opened an important exhibit on the representation of blacks in the French painting from the late 18th to the 1930s. The name of the exhibit is Le Modèle Noir, attracting a huge attention in France for some days now. So I thought that my different points could be well illustrated, so to speak, by paintings from this exhibit, which I will also briefly comment. Okay, so if I correct, I should press here. So my first point is about the fragility of citizenship. This fragility stems, I think, from the French Revolution and the very foundation of citizenship, which created universal citizenship and abolished slavery in 1794 under the pressure of the Haitian Revolution. This new citizenship, the invention of citizenship in France during the French Revolution, didn't last long, as slavery was reinstituted by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1802. A good example of this is this woman who is behind me on the right. Her name is Madeleine. She was a slave in Guadeloupe in the French Caribbean, brought to Paris as a free woman in 1798, 4 years after the abolition. Here she's painted by Madame Benoit in 1800, and 2 years later, she would be back to slavery in Guadeloupe, and we don't know what happened of her. The original title of this painting was Portrait of a Negro Woman, but thanks to research being done in the archives of the Benoit family, we know now that this woman's name was Madeleine. So we chose to rename the painting as Portrait de Madeleine in the exhibit, and it will remain so at the Louvre Museum when the painting gets back to the Louvre Museum in a few months from now. Another example is the man next to her, Jean-Baptiste Bellay, who was born in Senegal in 1746, was deported as a slave when he was a baby to Saint-Domingue in the 1750s, and he later bought his freedom and was elected to the French Parliament in 1793 as the representative of the island of Saint-Domingue with the aim of abolishing slavery. So he's painted here as one of the proud representatives having abolished slavery. But when Napoleon reinstituted slavery, he also decided, Napoleon, that all non-whites had to leave Paris and the surrounding area, which forced Bellay out of Paris in 1802. Obviously, all French lost their citizenship with the Empire and the Restoration. But citizenship, that's my point here, was first questioned on the basis of race. The first unsettled citizens of the French Republic were the former slaves. My second point is about the gift of citizenship, what I call the gift of citizenship. That is the fact that the French Republic has often presented political rights as granted, as generously granted by the state. A good example of that is the second abolition of slavery in 1848, as painted by Billard here, who was officially commissioned by the Republic to celebrate the abolition, which is typical of the narrative which the Republic wanted to impose: citizenship granted to slaves by the envoy of the Republic. Slaves, as you can see, very happy and surprised. As you may know, the historical situation was vastly different, as slaves had already rebelled at the news of a revolution in Paris. When the abolition was proclaimed, officially proclaimed in the spring of 1848, the French Caribbean were uprising on a massive scale. So here, it is really about the memory of slavery. The new citizens should be thankful in a way and shouldn't ask for more. They shouldn't ask for reparations, of course. The issue of reparations surfaced as soon as 1848, but the former slave owners, and only them, received substantial amounts of money for the loss of their human capital. Same, actually, in the United Kingdom a few years earlier. My third point would be about the invisibility of the non-white citizens. Many observers of French social and political life seem to have recently discovered the existence of black populations in metropolitan France. On an individual level, these people may be visible, but as a social group and as a cognitive category, French blacks don't have much of an existence for social scientists as well as policy makers. They have indeed been called invisible men and women. As a group, they don't have any existence since the Republic doesn't officially recognize ethno-racial minorities and has defined itself as colorblind with no racial bias. This situation would not be a problem if the social difficulties encountered by French blacks were acknowledged and analyzed. As I argue, this is not the case, so this invisibility, rather than being the logical consequence of a quiet life in French society, can be analyzed as a consequence of discriminatory processes. On the academic level, the situation is rather similar. In France, there are more books and articles published on African Americans than on African French or Caribbean French people. Indeed, African American history is a fairly well-established field in France, in contrast to studies on African immigrants, African students, Guadeloupean civil servants, Senegalese tirailleurs, etc., which are scarce, and there's not much on French blacks, as if this notion had no legitimacy or meaning to describe past and contemporary social situations. In the exhibit Modèle Noir, I told you that we wanted to rename those who had no name including one of the model of the late 19th century. Her name was Laure. You can see her in, there's 2 paintings by Manet, and thanks to research by Denise Morel and another curator of the exhibit, Isolde Pludermacher, Laure and other anonymous models have been put to the forefront. Denise Morel tells about her art history courses at Columbia University 10 years ago when she was studying the painting Olympia, the famous painting Olympia on the left, which was painted in 1865. And she remarked that the black person, that is Laure in the background, was not even mentioned by the art professor analyzing the painting. And she also remarked that there are more studies in France on the black cat, which is on the bed, than on Laure herself. And Laure didn't have any name, literally, but we delved into, with the 3 of us, delved into the archives for the last year and found quite a few things on this woman who shifted from small jobs, model, but also servant, also she took care of babies, and she did all kind of small jobs at that time. We don't know what happened of her after 1880. So the issue of invisibility is very much there, including obviously in the fine arts, and that's one of the objectives of the exhibit, to tell a different story. My 4th point is about the language. Here I mean the ways in which institutions of the French state have used the French language to make proper distinctions between French citizens and French subjects of the colonial empire. The French language was seen as too sophisticated to be properly learned by the subjects. During World War I, when 150,000 African soldiers came to fight in the trenches, a new language was invented named Français tirailleur, a pidgin French, supposedly easier to learn for simple minds. Then this pidgin French, invented by French linguists, came to be so closely associated to Africans that it was naturalized and seen as their language. Most non-whites in France have stories to tell about people talking to them in a simplified French, talking slowly as if they couldn't understand. Here you have on this slide the manual, that is the book that was published during the war and in the subsequent years, so as to familiarize the soldiers with the French. But the French, as it is explained and taught in this little textbook, is not a standard French. It is a simplified French, as I said, and you have an example of that in this sentence at the bottom of this commercial, yabon, meaning it's good, but it's not good French. Obviously, it's this pidgin French invented, again, by the French linguist. The command of French is still one of the current criteria to get French citizenship, with French exams becoming harder and harder over the years. And I suspect that quite a few French people would not pass the exam. We can also think of the efforts by the French state to erase local accents in metropolitan France, especially through the higher education system. The intimate link between citizenship and language is crucial when analyzing the internal boundaries of citizenship. My 5th point is about getting citizenship. Several thousands of the World War I African soldiers chose to stay in France after 1918 in spite of the French authorities, which insisted that the colonial soldiers had to return to their native colonies. A mixed population of persons from Africa and the Caribbean grew in the interwar period, I think around 30,000 people, at a time when blacks were not only a matter of colonial discourses, but became a fairly banal fact in Paris, Marseille, or Bordeaux. The issue of citizenship soon came to the forefront since many of these soldiers, former soldiers, veterans, subjects of the empire were asking for French citizenship. And most of their demands, I believe 80% of their demands, were turned down. When looking at the files, we can see that they did not deserve citizenship. The merits, mérites non prouvés, non-proved merits. Marriage to a French citizen did not automatically grant it citizenship and still does not. A citizenship based on merits included a higher education degree. For example, this is how Senghor, born in Senegal, became a French citizen in 1932, since he went to the Sorbonne University. Political support or fame. Here I found the application for citizenship by Josephine Baker in 1937 when she married a French man, Jean Lyon. In the file, there is a note by the American consul which basically says that there is no need to start a more detailed inquiry regarding Josephine Baker. She was obviously so well known that there was no need to go further, and this is how she was granted French citizenship while keeping her American citizenship. But when we delve into applications from anonymous people, we can really see the discrepancy between, on one side, the official criteria to get French citizenship and the actual practices regarding citizenship. The actual practices can only be seen through the individual files when looking at the little notes written by the mayor, written by the governor, the préfet of such or such area, regarding the morality of the soldier, explaining that if a soldier, if it's a former veteran, it was often the case in the 1920s and 1930s, all kind of things that are taken into account when granting citizenship. So citizenship is not about the general law, it's really about the specifics of it. My last point is about exoticism and the fact that the depiction of non-whites as foreigners, visitors, sometimes unwanted visitors, migrants, is still very vivid, as the French have been struggling with the transformation of French society. And here you can see the depiction of Josephine Baker, obviously in highly exoticized ways in the 1920s and 1930s. And if there is one question which black persons have often to answer in France, it is, where do you come from? And if you say, well, I'm from Paris, it's my case, people say, but where do you really come from? As if, obviously, you were coming from some kind of exotic country. So, as a conclusion, to quote Professor Mack this morning, who raised the question of the meaning of formal citizenship, if it's still a valid category of analysis, my answer would be that the most fragile, vulnerable take formal citizenship very seriously. Thousands every year apply in the US or in France to get citizenship. And it is not an easy process, which speaks volume about the importance of it. In the case of black persons in France, citizenship can be seen as a protection against some of the most burdensome kinds of racial injustice, and most importantly, facilitate the trips to their native countries. However, there are also internal boundaries between different groups of citizens. The Yellow Vest movement in France recently showed how class, in the Marxist sense, still very much matters in political activism and consciousness. The Yellow Vests speak about being second-class citizens. There are also racial boundaries, as we have seen, also prompting the activists of BLM France to speak of being second-class citizens. I'm not sure that the language of second-class citizenship is very helpful from an analytical standpoint. I like much better the idea of unsettled citizen. I also speak of vulnerable citizens. However, what matters here is that the demands for rights, wages, healthcare, the police, better behavior of the police, education, etc., are still framed in the language of citizenship. I think it tells a lot about the enduring power of citizenship in France as well as in the United States. Thank you.
Good morning. When people ask, where are you really from? They often say, well, there's no country called Hmong, so where are you really from? So I get that question all the time, too. So it is indeed a great pleasure for me to be here today. Thank you so much to the committee for inviting me. What I want to do today is that I think that all of the topics that you talked about, even the chickenization, is very important in terms of Hmong American lives in the United States. Many Hmong actually became chicken farmers, and I've actually studied some of the farms that they buy, and they're very tragic stories. So thank you so much for all of you for being here too. And I think, you know, just having me come today says a lot about the kinds of things that we want to talk about as a nation. And earlier, we talked about how citizenship was sort of promised before people even came to this country. So there's so much I want to talk about, but I think that for the purpose of our conversation today, I want to show how Hmong American veterans' mobilization for citizenship and belonging, especially incorporating into US military history, sort of demonstrates the different ways in which they are people who have very little agency, the ways in which we've described them, but at the same time, they've exercised tremendous agency in terms of reframing this whole idea that they were merely foreign mercenaries, reframing that narrative, constituting their military service during the war to be something that's very patriotic. Right, something very patriotic. And so when I talk about Hmong experiences, what I want to hope to do today is to demonstrate that really the extent to which ethnic minorities like the Hmong are perceived to be included or not really depends on the different ways in which states have various processes to incorporate marginalized groups. So just so that we are all on the same page, I want to do a 1-minute Hmong history because I think not everyone may have that. I know we're at Harvard, but sometimes people still have questions for me. So I will do a 1-minute history. So for most of you who may have heard of Hmong, I hope it's not just through Gran Torino. So the Hmong are an ethnic minority group where about 4 million still live in southern China. That's where our roots are. But in the mid to late 1800s, some of my ancestors began to move to what is called the Indo-Chinese Peninsula. And in the 1950s, 60s, with the emergence of the Cold War, then it was really precisely because they became involved in the clandestine army. That we know that for the United States, over 3 million Americans served in Vietnam, right, American soldiers, but because of Lao neutrality, there weren't American soldiers inside of Laos. And so the United States had to create these foot soldiers to support the larger war in Laos. So this is just an image of some of the soldiers' children that were being trained and paid for by the United States during the course of the Vietnam War. So for me, I think it's very important to talk about this a little bit more in depth because from 1961 to 1973, over 40,000 Hmong combatants served in this clandestine army out of a population of a little bit more than 300,000. And during the course of the war, about 17,000 combatants died. So when we compare that to 58,000 Americans who died, I mean, several hundred thousand who were injured as well, but 40,000 out of a population of 300,000, and then 17,000 died. And then thousands more died as we escaped Laos to seek refuge in Thailand. So over the course of the war, we became displaced, internally displaced within Laos in our mountains and villages and towns, wars that were decided on the other side of the world that had nothing to do with us, but that we became entangled in that. So after the war ended in 1975, again, it ended for the United States in 1973, but for Hmong and other Southeast Asians, it did not end until 1975. And over 170,000 Hmong have been resettled in the Western Hemisphere. The vast majority of us came to the United States, about 140,000 in the United States, a little bit more than 10,000 in France because of the colonial history. So a lot of the things that Pap talked about are very much relevant to Hmong experiences as well. So the vast majority, again, came to the United States. We have very small populations, went to Canada and Australia, and about a couple dozen families to Argentina and Germany, okay? So today, I think there are about, the 2017 U.S. American Community Survey estimated a little bit over 300,000 Hmong in the United States. And we are all over the country. California, Wisconsin, and Minnesota are the 3 states with the largest Hmong population. So that will help to explain some of the things that I will show you about why these things are happening in these various parts of the country. But one point to make that's very important is that the vast majority of Hmong came from an agrarian background. They were Hmong people who received formal education and French, as well as being trained in English to work with the Americans during the war. But the vast majority of the people who came to this country came with very limited education. So indeed, by the mid-1970s, early 1980s, you see all these Asian whiz kids, right? At Time Life magazine. And for the Hmong Americans, we couldn't live up to that model minority identity. And so people began to talk about how we didn't belong in this country. Many people talked about how we didn't belong because we didn't fit neatly into that minority status. So beginning in the mid-1980s, you began to have Hmong veterans creating organizations, wanting to lobby Congress to seek formal recognition. So very instrumental is the creation of several organizations, veterans organizations. I mean, things like this didn't exist before they came to the United States, but they learned about the different processes in this country and how to get access to recognition. So the Lao Veterans of America, and I won't read through all of them, but pay attention to the mission, the purpose of these organizations, right? The Lao Veterans of America, really very much pro Vang Pao, the Hmong general who the US, the CIA in particular, worked with. The organization's purpose is really about not just recognition for Hmong, but for US national security. Yeah, so think about the language that they use in their own missions. And then one of the most common descriptions of Hmong, especially by CIA and other people who worked with them in Laos, is that the Lao Hmong and American Coalition formed in the mid-1990s was that they were, or we, I should say we, were America's staunchest allies, most loyal allies in terms of all the different covert operations across the world. And then another organization that's very active now is the SGU, the Special Guerrilla Unit in Family Development of USA. So really to get benefits for Hmong, be acknowledged as veterans, and then also very much talking about the Hmong's unique military service to America during the war. So they learned how things work in this country, right? So legislative advocacy is one of the most common examples of Hmong trying to get recognition. In 2000, signed by President Clinton, the Hmong Veterans Naturalization Act. Really, again, as I mentioned, people came to this country with very limited formal education. They didn't speak English, very difficult for people who are 40, 50 years old who have never gone to school to be able to learn English and then pass that citizenship test, which I know when I administer, most of my American students can't pass. And I had to take that when I was 18 years old. But really, the act was to facilitate, right, to make it easier for Hmong soldiers in particular who served in this clandestine army, who can prove that they actually served in those army forces, to have the language waiver, right, the English waived, and then also the civic education part waived as well for some of them. And spouses of those who passed away could benefit from that as well. But perhaps the most instrumental legislation, which just passed very recently this spring, is the Hmong Veterans Recognition Act of 2018. And here, again, the whole idea that Hmong veterans continually perpetual is that we were willing to die for the American nation before we even set foot on US soil. So as a benefit, they have been advocating this for years, right, for many, many years. And finally, 2018, this passes. And now Hmong soldiers or veterans who, again, could document that they served could be buried in national cemeteries, with the exception of Arlington National Cemetery. So besides legislation, one of the most common activities that Hmong communities across the country have done is to advocate for and build memorials. Really getting their supporters to support creation of memorials at the national level as well as in local communities. And you'll see why they exist in the different locations that I'll talk about. So through much advocacy work, and by the mid-1990s, the CIA, especially William Colby, who had served during the Secret War, and many other Americans who worked with Hmong in Laos, began to acknowledge this unique role that Hmong people play during the Vietnam War or during the US Secret War in Laos. So in the mid-1990s, the first memorial, it's not even a memorial, the little plaque, can I get a show of him? Has anybody ever seen this? Okay, so the gentleman in the back. So this Laos memorial, recognizing Hmong and Lao and Americans who served in Laos, is in Arlington National Cemetery. So small, it's right on Grand Avenue, overlooking the Tomb of the Unknown. Very interestingly, small plaque, but every year, Hmong American veterans come to have a memorial service there. So very interesting that it's actually right in the heart of, the American nation, the Arlington National Cemetery. But what's probably more interesting is all the different community efforts across the country to build war memorials. This one in Fresno, California, the biggest single city concentration of Hmong in the nation. The Twin Cities is the biggest, but in terms of a concentration, but in terms of a city, it's Fresno. It's not really fair to count St. Paul and Minneapolis, but we tend to want to be, I grew up in Minnesota, so we tend to think that that's the most important part. At any rate, in Fresno, this wonderful memorial is built right in front of the courthouse. It's community driven, right? And it's also, the local leadership that advocated for, supported the construction of this memorial. But you'll see this dominant narrative of the Secret War, where American soldiers were rescued by Hmong pilots and also Hmong soldiers, right? So that's a typical memorial in terms of war memorial. So around the base, you'll have this history about how the Hmong deserve to be here, and that these memorials represent why they are a part, they're friends in our community. But something that's very interesting, the next year, in 2006, a large memorial is erected in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. And maybe most people have never heard of Sheboygan, right? A little bit about an hour north of Milwaukee, right? Overlooking Lake Michigan, right in a public park. Even when people come to this event, it's like 24 panel with history, with all kinds of, rationale for why Hmong people are here in that community. So whether or not people want to engage, people who visit the park, whether or not they want to engage, they can't avoid it. It's so big, right in front of them. So children, visitors from all kinds of ages will have to engage even if they don't want to. And then, again, changing a little bit to Minnesota, where we have large Hmong populations. It's interesting how that didn't come first, right? So in Wisconsin, Wausau, Wisconsin, is a place that if you've ever read about immigration, Royal Backs out of court in the late 1990s, really was very important in lifting or educating people all over the country about the problems with Hmong refugees in Wausau, Wisconsin. Today, Wausau's population has over 10% that are Hmong. And before the Hmong arrived, I think the people of color population was almost, with the exception of the native population, very, very few people. With the exception, maybe a few Korean adoptees, but other than that, there were no diversity in terms of racial composition. But in Wausau, this wonderful 2016 memorial is erected. Again, very typical, similar to the one in Fresno. And no longer are they talking about Hmong and US, soldiers in Laos. In fact, they're claiming, this is the Hmong Vietnam War Memorial in Wisconsin. And then the same year, right in front of the state capitol in St. Paul, Minnesota, this over 10 years of work raising money by the local Hmong community as well as friends of the Hmong community in the Twin Cities. 2016, this memorial is built right in front on Capitol ground. So instead of soldiers, you see this vigorous sprout is what they call it, and around it you have stories of village life, war, migration around that. So it tells a larger community story than just veterans. And then last but not least, I have plans in the state of Wisconsin, in La Crosse, Wisconsin, right on the Mississippi River. There's now under construction a new memorial. So Hmong people are spread all over Wisconsin. And so there's going to be a new memorial built, but you'll see that now it's called Hmong Lao Vietnam Veterans Memorial. So now including some of the other ethnic Lao individuals as well. So just a couple of points that I want to make. This memorial building practice is actually not just unique to the United States. We are the largest population in terms of Hmong in this country. However, in France in particular, the second largest Hmong diaspora community, in 2013, there was a memorial erected to recognize the Hmong who have moved to France. But what's interesting is that the inscription on that memorial in 2010, which was located in Auberge-Nissener, and what the memorial and the inscription actually says, "À la mémoire des Hmong morts pour la France." So this is really recognizing the Hmong who sided with the French during the First Indochina War. So interestingly, not neglecting the American war, but really lifting that colonial history in that alliance with the French during that war. In 2016, there's ceremonies in Lyon, and then also very, very recently, February 16, 2019, at Garonne, there's another memorial, again, built recognizing the Hmong who died for France. So in fact, to me, it's very interesting that picking up in French Guiana, where some of the Hmong currently live, there's now ceremonies to recognize the Hmong combatants during the First Indochina War. So just a few thoughts in my last minute here is that I think as Cold War refugees, the Hmong were indeed really voting with our feet to come to the United States. And as refugees, we were legally admitted into the United States, and we have access to eventually become citizens if we are able to. And for those who couldn't, there have been efforts to facilitate that process, to enable them to become US citizens. But what's interesting is that almost always, in terms of Hmong veterans and Hmong Americans, especially the elders, almost always referencing their sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice that one makes being willing to die for a nation as the reason why we in the industry deserve to be here in the United States, that we earn our place to be here. That's the message over and over again. Politicians, people who support Hmong Americans, almost always, you can't avoid not talking about our sacrifices during the war, justifying our presence in this great nation. So thank you so much.
So as with the first panel, we're going to take a few minutes to sort of chat among ourselves, and then we'll open things up for questions. I'm struck by the ways that in the first panel, we thought about the unevenness of citizenship, and there's a sort of sense that there's perhaps hierarchies that are attached to that. Some citizenships are better than other citizenships, but I think what that first panel was getting at was actually something that's more complicated than that, right? There's no clear hierarchy. There's a continuing set of shifting possibilities. The ground is a little open. I mean, two of the things that I sort of heard out of our papers, and I'll just sort of throw this out, and perhaps folks would like to sort of respond or not, or perhaps you all just have things to say to each other. In some ways, there's a sort of perhaps a little bit of a typology that emerges out of this. So I was just listing, of course, we have the regular kind of formal legal citizenship that we think about. We have cultural forms of citizenship, cultural claims. We clearly have racially defined citizenships, sort of black colonial soldiers. In France, blood quantum is, for Native people, sort of a racializing practice that goes to citizenship at the very moment that the institutions of tribal governance are claimed through a legal case called Morton v. Mancari, which is under grave threat at this particular moment, to be political, not racial groups, right? So there's a really interesting and odd tension around this. There's clearly sort of kin citizenships when Josephine Baker doesn't actually have to prove anything. There's a fame citizenship. She gets to sort of count for two different categories. There's certain kinds of merit citizenships, which we oftentimes hear about today. We only want certain people of merit to be in certain kind of places, which then includes the sense that if there are people without merit, they actually don't deserve to be here. There's a sense of a sort of gifted citizenship with the question of slavery in particular, right? You ought to be grateful because now we're going to make you a citizenship. the value of citizenship is your reparation, right? Be quiet and be grateful. And then this sort of sense of repayment or service citizenship, I think, which is so often attached to the military, the sense of blood sacrifice prior to even thinking about citizenship. We see this with African-American colonial French soldiers. We clearly see it with Native American soldiers in World War I, leading to the Citizenship Act of 24, and World War II, Native American stuff happens. And so there's this sort of typology that sort of arranges itself here. And then I think there's a set of pathways also, how we imagine thinking about citizenship. And certainly the African-American narrative in the United States gives us one of these pathways, from slavery to freedom to citizenship. Freedom is the way station on its way to citizenship, right? So the slavery to citizenship thing is not necessarily kind of direct, and there are certain meanings that are implicated in freedom in relation to citizenship. What I heard was a couple other pathways as well, sort of a military kind of citizenship that leads to a claim of patriotism as the grounds for a claim to citizenship, or sovereignty in a tribal context that leads to a claim to citizenship, or I think, this is the last thing I'll say, what we heard in particular is sort of sense in which nationalism is a sort of route into a claim to citizenship as well. And I think it takes us to sort of the very famous Benedict Anderson argument about citizenship being, or the nation being constituted as an imaginary community, too large to actually be a physical face-to-face community, but an imagined kind of community. And of course, Anderson said there are many, many ways in which that imagination takes place, including things like memorials and museums. And I think it's not out of line to suggest that the memorialization, and particularly around the patriotic claim of soldiers and military service, is really key here. Jill didn't mention it, although we were talking about it before. The Native American Veterans Memorial is being planned right now. Will go up on the Mall in 2020, as I recall, and sort of, and then this list of military memorials, which are sort of everywhere and extend into France. So these to me feels like the things that are sort of on the table, and there's a relationship here between citizenship, nationalism, rights, patriotism, all of these things, which is a little hard to untangle. And so I'm wondering if folks have sort of thoughts about this, or perhaps if there are things that you'd like to say to each other relative to what you've heard.
I just want to say that, you were speaking about African colonial subjects in Paris, right? I think most people know the story much better now too, but you have so much of the Indo-Chinese, colonial subjects going to Paris, and that really raised consciousness of our, our most famous colonial subject, Ho Chi Minh. Really, I think very fascinating to see how they come to Paris and the idea of citizenship, right? Or it's sort of formed in that space. But in the colonial space, they're not able to really engage or benefit from the kinds of developments that were taking place in their own nation. So I think many Indo-Chinese colonial subjects, I think after the war, many people became French citizens as well. When I lived in Paris, what's interesting is that they had ceremonies as well to remember their sacrifice. But it wasn't until all these different things that were happening here in the United States. So remember, things were already, legislative actions were taking place here in the United States for years, and then just a ceremony in France in 2013. So it is really through this diasporic consciousness that Hmong in France and in French Guiana are now understanding how they too can then demonstrate their patriotism or commitment to the French nation by articulating their sacrifices on the French side during the war.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's Hmong soldiers who served in the French army during the the first war in Indochina, are being honored now with different memorials. And I was surprised to realize how many of these were inaugurated or have been inaugurated for this past few years. But I would argue that there are more of these memorials regarding the soldiers than African soldiers, you see. So we are talking about different kinds of merits regarding the military service. And which is a way for me, of course, to get back to the issue of race. There are different kinds of non-white soldiers, and in a way it relates to a somehow more positive image of Asian migrants who are seen as hard workers, who are seen as not complaining about their situation, unlike migrants coming from Africa. So here we're talking about different kinds of military service, which is a way for me to, of course, to relate to what you said. The idea that you deserve or not becoming a citizen is very central. The idea of a specific merit, whatever it is, what you did, the way you studied, the way you fought, and so on and so forth, are very central elements into the opening of the door, literally, of citizenship. But when you look at that, I think what has struck me is the highly fluctuant appreciation of these merits, because it's not written in the law. It really depends on local officials. It really depends on the kind of interpersonal relationship which people may have. So here we deal with the law as a very fluctuant and practical set of practices which can really vary from one place to another. But again, the idea that some people deserve and others don't seem to me very central in the understanding of who deserves to be French or American, for that matter.
Yeah, and I think, I didn't talk about this too much, but maybe I'll add, in the American Indian context, the citizenship was more a route, the US was hoping anyway, that would be more of a route to assimilation and disenfranchisement from tribal citizenship. So in part, the 1924 Citizenship Act was connected to American Indians who served in the First World War, and some of them served potentially out of patriotism to the US, but many of them served for a host of other reasons, because they were recruited out of boarding schools, because there weren't other economic opportunities available to them. And for some of them also participating in the American military, because by that point tribes weren't having their own military societies, weren't active anymore. Participating in the US and having that battle experience could inaugurate them into certain ceremonial societies within the tribe. And so the US might have seen it as, oh, we're gonna get these American Indian soldiers, they're gonna become so patriotic and assimilate. And while that may be true to a small extent, by and large, American Indians have always fought and advocated for maintaining tribal citizenship, and that US citizenship does not diminish our tribal citizenship. And so there is the tension of dual citizenship for American Indians, and then as I talked more about the US efforts to limit citizenship in American Indian nations to hopefully move towards American Indians just being US citizenship and getting rid of the other status.
I mean, it's a sort of amazing moment where citizenship for Native people really does function as a sort of technology of erasure.
Yes.
In terms of tribal citizenship and sort of pulling into a sort of full assimilation kind of thing. So it's interesting that some of the dynamics are like keeping people away from citizenship when in fact pulling Indian people into citizenship for the purposes of making them not Indian is this really interesting thing that happens. So we've reached the sort of moment where we open things up to questions. I will sort of simply second my colleague earlier this morning, Kenneth Mack, in saying the microphone is here. Please step to the line. Please tell us your name. Please ask a question. Please don't make a statement. We all know how the rules work. If it works well, things will go well. And we don't all have to answer to every question. I think it's important for us to have as many voices as we can rather than sort of have everybody respond. So with that.
Hi, I'm Adam Strong from an organization called Reimagining Migration. I love these presentations.
Adam, can you get closer to the microphone? Thank you.
So I love these presentations. They were great, and they had me thinking both about the texture of what you said, but also broader. So I'm thinking about When do complementary or transnational or communal claims of citizenship, when do they strengthen the efforts for people to get full rights and full recognition of citizenship? And when do they get seen as weakening those arguments, especially considering many folks who are claiming full citizenship and are deprived of them are already stereotyped as disloyal? So I'm just interested, especially I'm thinking, comes out of the discussion of the French case. That's where my head is at.
Should I?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's when interviewing many French blacks, when I wrote a study on that, a book on that, I was struck by how much they insisted on their French citizenship. They would, just come forward and say, "Oh, I'm French," and you have really to spend time with people so that they can mention their origin and talk about that. But their first move really is to insist on their Frenchness in ways which I think blacks in the United Kingdom do not do as much. There is this idea, I'm French. The insistence of French is interesting, of course, because it can be seen as a way to protect themselves against issues regarding, and people suspecting precisely their Frenchness. When you have to deal with the police, when you have to deal with some administration using the tu rather than vous as a way to interact with people, people immediately say, but I'm French, you see. That's a way they're asking for respect, etc. And I was suspecting at first that people would be more willing to insist on their transnational, multinational identities, but not so much. In fact, unless they are in a safe environment, of course, among friends and family, where, of course, identity can be more subtle and can imply the national origins in ways which people do not in a more formal environment.
Hi, my name is Jitendra Singh, and I've been catching a theme here related to Native Americans, especially the question of identity or citizenship being measured by your bloodlines, basically, or analysis of blood. And, and I know Professor Deloria mentioned this a few minutes ago, but I'd like to tease that question apart a little bit. There's been this theme of blood percentage. There's the much reviled blood and soil discussion from racism and I'm trying to reconcile those two. In the face of a global climate crisis where actual citizenship doesn't matter because people need to eat and they need to go to where they are safe. So I'm struggling with those questions, and any insights you have, I would appreciate. Thank you.
Do you want to? I don't know.
I can say a few things. I think the sort of the nature of blood quantum, right, which, as Jill, I think, sort of really quite artfully showed, right, this is not part of sort of older native kinds of traditions of belonging, acknowledgement, and membership, right? Kinship matters, right? But blood is a racial imposition, right? The United States does in the late 19th century and continues forward. But it continues with such power that actually Native people end up sort of adopting and appropriating that racialized language in order to think about themselves and membership and affiliation kinds of issues. Many, many people within these groups would say, well, that's wrong, that's not a good idea. We should really do lineal descent. This is a way of thinking in kinship terms and family terms. But we should also think, like, if we say, look, this is not a racial group, Native people have political relations with the federal government, right, as tribal nations, then we could be thinking about citizenship in very, very different ways, right, with our own naturalization processes, which might involve learning language, for example, or doing other things, or living in community, or making other certain kinds of criteria for citizenship then start to emerge, which are quite different from saying there's a racial identity attached to that. And that feels to me like an option, not just for Native people to think harder about this question, but for everybody to think about it. And it may speak to sort of the question about how we think citizenship in a global sense in a moment of climate change. I don't exactly know, and I don't want to go too far down the roads making big claims about this, but Native people and the dilemmas that they face oftentimes are not marginal to the larger world in which we live, although we oftentimes treat it that way, incorrectly. Go ahead, please.
My name is Ricardo Cortez, and I would like to know if any of you can comment on perhaps one item that was not really introduced on your discussions on gatekeepers, as the perception of how you're going to be voting if you are a citizen. I mean, Cuban immigrants are allowed into the country very easily, where citizens from Central America, Mexico, they are not.
So the question is about voting, maybe. So for a lot of Hmong American veterans, I mean, things have changed over time. I think during the Cold War in the 80s, and when Hmong Americans were viewed as these freedom fighters, then in terms of federal issues, people were very much supported by, more Republican legislators, right? They were very much. But in terms of domestic issues, so many people struggling, living in poverty, then it is really voting more towards the left. That's been the trend over time. But as we live here longer in this country, I see a larger split in the community where many people are doing better for themselves. And then they're beginning to now be those gatekeepers, right? We came here, we struggle, we made it, so those people should do the same thing. And so the policy changes or thinking or affiliations, alliances we're becoming like other Americans. That's all I'm saying. Much more diverse, not all just freedom fighters, but people thinking about what they're interested in their local communities as well as their state issues. So much more diverse than before. Before you would have a certain kind of politicians that would come to Hmong events to get them all to vote. And Hmong elder leaders will always say, okay, everyone vote for this person. So it's not about the issues that they're representing, but it's what the elders tell people to vote. But that's no longer the case. And for those of you who know a little bit about Hmong Americans, we have been very, very active politically in the state of Minnesota, in Wisconsin, and California. In particular, Minnesota, in the 2018 special elections, we had 11 Hmong Americans who were elected to judgeships and also state and local positions. So we're changing as well.
Yeah, it reminds me of a study I did quite a few years ago, asking people about the reasons why they applied to French citizenship. So they would start with some lip service to France. I feel French and French history. I love whatever food, whatever would come up. Just what I call lip service. Okay, and then once the lip service was over, you would get to very practical things. No problem with the administration anymore. And very important, the possibility to travel. That's very, very important. Travel back and forth between France and their native countries, which is a real serious issue, because each time you leave France, you never know if you can come back, if you won't get into trouble at the police, at the airport, and so on. So these are very practical issues. Then I was expecting voting rights to be very important. Yes, they are mentioned, but they seem to be less important than the possibility to travel freely. Voting rights are important, but they depend very much onto the political consciousness, so to speak, of the people being interviewed. People, of course, being members of political organizations, trade unions, mention voting rights as very important. But for the just regular people without any specific political involvement, the most practical matters are put on the forefront once the lip service to France is being paid.
It feels like this is a discourse mobilized by political parties that does not necessarily match up with the people, on the ground. In Native American, right, there's 4 Native American folks in Congress right now. 2 are Republicans, 2 are Democrats. I mean, it's just not as predictable, I think, as folks would say. Please.
I'm David Allen. More on blood quantum. I am struck by the startling contrast between what we've learned this morning, the Chippewa approach to the question of percentage of blood and its role in belonging in citizenship on the one side, and on the other side, the white nationalist view that blood must be pure, which is, of course, evocative of what underlies here, us and them, the other and us, what's inside and outside the definitions of identity. The question is, might we use some of what we learned this morning as a model much more broadly here in our society and otherwise for moving forward on these questions of how we live with each other, overlapping memberships, instead of the horrors of 6 million exterminated in the Second World War because their blood wasn't pure. Over to you.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. This whole idea of blood as a metaphor has huge meanings in a variety of cultures over time. But the idea about blood as being something measurable and quantifiable and connected to citizenship was really, by and large, coming from the United States as a way to reduce the number of people, of American Indians who had that legal and political status as American Indians in order to erase that status. And, from an Anishinaabe point of view, the record is rich and clear that we're interrelated bodies of kin and families, and we have obligations to each other. We also have obligations to this land, which might connect briefly to the other question. And so if we think about our responsibilities, perhaps, rather than our rights, we think about our responsibilities and our relationships, that just gets us a whole other perspective, like the record of the Anishinaabe leaders who were speaking during this time saying, what happens if we're guided by the love of our children and our future generations? How does that change our perspective and how we treat each other? So it would be wonderful if we could be moving in that direction. It takes all of us, though. Yeah.
We just have a couple minutes left, so maybe we can quickly.
Hi, Noni Valentine. I have listened with such interest to your exploration of the dynamics of exclusion. And it's making me think about the other side. And if each of you was in a position a powerful position to determine citizenship for others, to decide who gets included seriously, what would be your fundamental criteria? Especially in view of merit, which you've spoken about, and some of the other themes. Thank you.
Well, thanks for a huge question as we're trying to wrap things up. I don't know if somebody would.
I don't think anybody told us we would have to answer that question when we were invited. Yeah, I don't have an answer, but I want to steal a little bit from Jill. I think what's more important, if I think about the world today, is that we need to be more kind to each other. We have this shared humanity, shared experiences on this earth. So I think it's important to have some kind of documentation and some kind of order within nations. I think that's important. But at the same time, if I were in charge, if I have the power you just asked me to imagine I may not give citizenship such a big priority. I might be very interested in this whole idea of the global citizen, because what I do here, right here on this campus, impacts somebody in other parts of the world. In the corporations that operate in all over the world, they have impact on, the dollars might come back to our community, but they impact those local communities. Very importantly, my uncles live in Laos, and the kinds of development, globalization that's reached their villages, the trucks coming to, the logging, all the film and all the environmental issues are impacting them. But so I think that's what I would do, is to put more emphasis on who we are as human beings, and we're more alike than we are different. But we spend so much time focusing on that difference.
So we've reached and actually exceeded our time, and I think this large question and this quite lovely response is perhaps a good way for us to end. Could you please join me in thanking the panel?